I didn't buy the lake to start a war. At least, that's what I told myself when the paperwork went through on a quiet Tuesday morning. The lake, 6 acres of clean water, a narrow strip of shoreline, and an overgrown access road, had been listed for months. Most people saw mosquitoes and maintenance. I saw peace, privacy, and a future fishing spot 10 minutes from my back porch. What I didn't fully appreciate was that the lake sat right next door to Karen. Karen had lived beside that water for so long she spoke about it like it was a family heirloom. Not owned, never owned, but emotionally possessed. She waved at people from her dock like a queen greeting subjects, corrected joggers on lake etiquette, and once told a delivery driver he couldn't park near her shoreline. None of it was hers. It never had been. The seller was an elderly man downsizing and moving closer to his kids. He didn't care who bought it as long as the check cleared and the headache stopped. By noon, the lake was mine. By 3:17 p.m., Karen knew. I was still unloading a couple of folding chairs from my truck when I heard the familiar screech of sandals on gravel. "You can't be here." That was how she opened. No hello. No question. Just a declaration. I turned around slowly. Karen stood at the edge of my access road, arms crossed, sunglasses tilted just low enough for dramatic effect. "I actually can," I said, holding up the manila folder. "I own the lake now." She laughed. A short, sharp sound. "That's funny." I didn't tell a joke. Her smile vanished. She marched closer, stopping exactly where the old property marker sat, as if muscle memory told her where to plant herself. "You're mistaken," she said. "This lake is shared. The neighborhood has always used it." "Used it," I repeated. "Not owned it." She jabbed a finger toward her backyard, where a manicured lawn rolled seamlessly toward the water. "My family has maintained that shoreline for 20 years. "That was generous of you," I said. "But it doesn't change the deed." That word, deed, hit her like a slap. Her face flushed red, then pale. "So, you're telling me I need your permission to walk down to the lake?" "I'm telling you," I said evenly, "that it's private property now." For a moment, she just stared. Then the meltdown began. Her voice rose, echoing across the water. She accused me of ruining the neighborhood, destroying traditions, and stealing something that belonged to everyone. She brought up property taxes, zoning, even her cousin who knows a lawyer. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just listened. Because while she was shouting, I was noticing things, like how her garden shed sat well past the boundary line, how her stone path curved into my land, how the back third of her lawn, lush, flat, and suspiciously perfect, wasn't hers at all. When she finally paused to breathe, I said, "Karen, have you ever had a survey done?" Her eyes narrowed. "Why would I need one?" "Because," I replied, tapping the folder, "I did." That was when the color drained from her face for real. I unfolded the survey map right there on the hood of my truck. Clear lines, clear measurements, and a very clear truth. Nearly half of what she thought was her backyard was actually part of the lake property. She shook her head. "That's wrong." "It's certified," I said. "County records." "This is harassment," she snapped. "You can't just come in here and change things." "I'm not changing anything," I said calmly. "I'm just enforcing what's always been true." She stormed off without another word, grass clippings flying behind her like evidence of a crime scene. That evening I made one phone call. A fencing company. 6 feet tall. Straight line. Exactly on the property boundary. The man on the other end whistled softly when I emailed the survey over. "You know this is going to cut through someone's yard." "I know," I said. 2 days later, wooden posts began appearing like exclamation points across the grass. And from the other side of the line, Karen screamed. Karen didn't come out screaming right away. That surprised me. The fencing crew arrived just after 8 a.m., orange vests bright against the green grass, post-hole digger thumping into the soil exactly where the survey stakes marked the line. Professional. Quiet. Efficient. The first post went in without incident. The second too. By the third, the back door of Karen's house flew open. "What do you think you're doing?" There it was. The full-volume Karen voice, sharp enough to carry across the lake. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The foreman glanced at me, I nodded, and he kept working. Karen marched across what used to be her lawn, now very clearly a construction zone, stopping inches from the survey stake. You can't put a fence there, she snapped. That's my yard. The foreman stayed calm. Ma'am, we're working off a certified survey. I don't care what your paper says, she barked. My kids played here. My dog runs here. This is my property. I finally stepped forward. Karen, please don't interfere with the crew. She whipped around. Interfere? You bought a lake just to spite me. I bought a lake. I corrected, because it was for sale. She pointed at the post again. You're cutting my yard in half. No, I said evenly. I'm reclaiming mine. That's when she tried a new tactic. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling the HOA. The foreman actually paused, shovel midair. I almost laughed. There is no HOA jurisdiction over this parcel, I said. Different zoning. Different ownership. She dialed anyway, pacing, loudly repeating phrases like hostile neighbor and illegal construction. She kept looking back at the crew, as if expecting them to stop any second. They didn't. By noon, the posts formed a straight, unmistakable line, an invisible wall made real. The lake breeze carried the sound of hammers, each strike landing like punctuation at the end of an argument Karen had already lost. She tried blocking the workers. That didn't go well. The foreman calmly informed her that interfering with contracted work on private property could get her removed. When that didn't scare her, he mentioned calling the county. She backed up, seething. You're ruining my home value, she hissed at me. I checked, I said. My fence doesn't affect your lot size. On paper. Her face twisted. You're enjoying this. I won't lie. A little. By late afternoon, the fence panels started going up. 6 feet tall. Solid. Clean. No gaps. No compromises. Karen stood on her patio, arms folded, watching as the reality sank in. The path she'd used for years now dead-ended at Freshwood. Her shed? Trapped on the wrong side. Her private lake access? Gone. She shouted once more, something about lawyers and injustice. I just leaned against my truck and watched the fence rise. Because for the first time since I bought the lake, it was finally quiet on my side. And Karen? Karen was officially fenced out. The fence was finished by sunset. 6 feet of fresh cedar stood where Karen's lawn used to flow naturally into the lake, each panel straight as a ruler and planted exactly on the surveyed boundary. The crew packed up, the foreman shook my hand, and the lake finally felt like it belonged to someone who knew where the property line actually was. That peace lasted until 7:04 a.m. the next morning. I woke up to the sound of furious knocking, short, sharp bursts like someone trying to hammer sense into a door. I didn't rush. I poured coffee, took a sip, and only then opened it. Karen stood there in a windbreaker and sunglasses, clutching a stack of papers like evidence in a courtroom drama. You need to take that fence down, she said. Good morning to you too, I replied. She shoved the papers toward me. I talked to my lawyer. I glanced at the top page. It wasn't a legal letterhead. It was a printed email chain with half the text highlighted in neon yellow. This says you're encroaching, she insisted. It actually says you might want to request a survey, I said, handing it back. Which I already did. Her jaw tightened. Your survey is wrong. Then commission your own, I said. We can compare. She scoffed. I shouldn't have to pay for this. That's the thing about assuming land is yours, I replied. Eventually, assumptions get expensive. She stared at me for a long moment, clearly recalculating. When intimidation didn't work and bluster failed, Karen tried something else. She smiled. It was thin and practiced. Look, she said softly, we're neighbors. We don't need to make this ugly. I leaned against the doorframe. I agree. So, she continued, gesturing vaguely toward the fence, maybe we can work something out. An easement. Shared access. Like before. Before, I said, was you using land you didn't own? Her smile vanished again. You're being unreasonable. I'm being precise. She turned on her heel and left without another word. 3 days later, the county inspector showed up.
Clipboard.
Polite smile. Routine questions. Someone had filed a complaint about unauthorized construction near a protected waterway. Karen stood on her patio the entire time, watching like a referee waiting to throw a flag. The inspector measured setbacks, checked permits, reviewed the survey, and nodded. Everything looks compliant, he said. Fence is exactly on the boundary. You're good. Karen's face tightened as if she'd bitten into something sour. But what about environmental impact? She pressed from across the fence. That land drains into the lake. The inspector didn't even look up. Ma'am, the fence doesn't alter drainage. And this lake is privately owned. That word again. Privately. Karen stormed inside. The next escalation came a week later. I noticed it while walking the fence line at dusk. Fresh tire tracks. On my side. Leading toward the old stone path that used to connect Karen's yard to the shoreline. She'd driven around the fence. Not through it, around it, using the narrow strip of access road near the trees. Technically still my land, but she'd found a gap where the fence stopped short of the tree line. I took photos. Dated.
Timestamped.
Then I installed a gate.
Locked. Posted. Clearly marked.
The following morning, Karen lost it. She stood at the gate, shaking it, shouting about harassment and false imprisonment. When that didn't work, she called the sheriff. The deputy arrived mid-afternoon, calm and courteous. I showed him the deed, the survey, the fence permit, the photos. He nodded. Looks like you're within your rights.
Karen pointed at the lake.
I've used that water for 20 years. The deputy shrugged. Use doesn't equal ownership. She tried one last angle. He's doing this to punish me. The deputy glanced at me. Are you? I thought for a moment. No, I said. I'm doing it to protect my property. The deputy tipped his hat and left. That night, Karen posted online. Neighborhood forums. Community groups. Long paragraphs about greedy outsiders and stolen land. She used words like community asset and shared heritage. I responded once. I posted a photo of the survey. Just the lines. No commentary. The thread went quiet. A few neighbors reached out privately. Some apologized. A couple admitted they'd always wondered where the actual boundary was. One asked if I planned to open the lake for fishing permits. Karen didn't speak to me after that. She avoided the fence like it might bite her. But the real shift happened a month later, when her own surveyor arrived. I watched from across the lake as he walked the line, measured, remeasured, and finally shook his head. Karen stood beside him, arms folded, defiant until the very end. When he handed her the map, her shoulders dropped. It matched mine.
Exactly.
That evening, she removed the shed herself, watched silently as movers hauled it piece by piece back onto what was truly her land. The stone path disappeared next. Then the garden beds. One by one, the pieces of borrowed space returned to their rightful place. The fence didn't move. The lake stayed quiet. And for the first time since I bought it, the water reflected nothing but trees, sky, and a boundary that finally meant something. The strangest thing about winning a dispute like that is the silence that follows. For weeks after Karen's shed was moved and her garden beds torn out, the lake settled into a calm I hadn't realized I'd been craving. No shouting across the water. No dramatic phone calls. No sandals scraping gravel like an alarm bell. Just wind in the trees and the low splash of fish breaking the surface near dusk. I started going down to the lake every evening. Not to gloat. Not to patrol. Just to sit. I brought a folding chair and a thermos, sometimes a book I barely read. The fence ran clean and straight behind me, its cedar panels already starting to weather from bright honey to soft gray. It didn't feel aggressive anymore. It felt correct. Like a sentence finally punctuated. Karen noticed.
Of course she did.
At first, she watched from her patio, pretending to water plants that were no longer anywhere near the fence line. Then she started timing her appearances, coming out when I was already there, standing just close enough to see me without actually acknowledging my existence. We didn't speak. That changed one Saturday morning when I heard voices by the gate. Not Karen's. I walked over to find two men in polos, clipboards in hand. Realtors. They smiled the kind of smile people practice in mirrors.
"Morning," one of them said.
"We're here to take photos of the neighboring property." "Which one?" I asked, though I already knew. They gestured toward Karen's house. "She's selling?" I said.
They exchanged a glance.
"That's the plan." I thanked them and walked back to the lake, trying not to react. Still, the news rippled through me. Karen's selling meant something had shifted. Either she'd decided to retreat, or she'd found a new battlefield somewhere else. By noon, a sign went up. For sale. Lake View. Spacious yard. I almost laughed. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it wasn't lost on potential buyers either. I watched more than one couple walk the yard, glance at the fence, then pull out their phones to check maps. Their smiles faded quickly. Karen must have noticed. That afternoon, she finally approached the fence. Not screaming, not posturing, just walking up slowly, hands clasped in front of her like someone approaching a confession booth. "I need to talk to you," she said. I stood but didn't step closer. "About what?" She hesitated. That alone was new. "The listing," she said. "The fence is complicating things." "I imagine it would," I replied. She sighed, shoulders sagging. "Buyers keep asking why it's there. And I don't know what to tell them," she admitted. "That I used to own the land? That I thought I did." "You could tell them the truth," I said gently. "That the boundary was corrected." She winced. "That makes me sound bad." I didn't respond. After a long pause, she said, "Would you consider moving it?" There it was. "No," I said. She nodded as if she'd expected that answer, but needed to hear it anyway. "What if I paid for an easement? Just a narrow one. Visual access. It would help the sale." "I didn't buy the lake for someone else's view," I said. "I bought it for privacy." Her jaw tightened. "You're punishing me." "I'm protecting myself," I said. "There's a difference." She looked out over the water, eyes lingering on the dock she no longer used. "You know," she said quietly, "I really thought it was mine." "I believe you," I replied. "But believing something doesn't make it true." That seemed to land harder than anything I'd said before. A week later, the listing photos changed. No more wide shots of the yard. No more lake angles. Just interior rooms and staged furniture. The price dropped. Then dropped again. The neighborhood reacted in its own quiet way. A few people waved more often. A couple stopped by to introduce themselves properly for the first time. One older man brought me a map he'd kept from when the area was first subdivided. "Thought you might appreciate this," he said. "A lot of folks got creative with boundaries over the years." I thanked him and added the map to my growing folder of documents, not because I needed it, but because it felt like closure. Karen's house sold in late autumn. Not for what she wanted. Not even close. On moving day, I watched from the far side of the lake as a truck was loaded. Karen supervised quietly. No dramatic gestures, no last stands. When everything was packed, she stood alone on her patio for a long time, staring at the fence. Finally, she walked over. "This is goodbye," she said. I nodded. "I wish you luck." She hesitated, then said, "I should have checked the lines." "Yes," I agreed. She left without another word. The new owners arrived a month later. A young couple. They knocked on my door with a plate of cookies and a question. "Is the lake private?" they asked. "It is," I said. "But we're open to talking." They smiled, relieved. For the first time, the fence wasn't a weapon or a warning. It was just a line. And on my side of it, the lake was finally at peace. Winter came quietly to the lake. The kind of winter that didn't announce itself with storms or drama, but with thin ice at the shoreline and mist lifting slowly off the water at dawn. The trees shed their last leaves, and the fence, once the loudest object in the neighborhood, faded into the background like it had always been there. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The new neighbors, Mark and Elise, moved in just after the first frost. They were polite, curious in a cautious way, and refreshingly honest. On their second day, Mark walked the fence line with a map in hand, stopping at the gate like someone approaching a border crossing. "I just want to be clear," he said, tapping the paper. "This is all accurate, right?" I smiled. "Painfully accurate." He laughed, relief washing over his face.
Good.
"We don't want any history." Elise nodded behind him. "The seller mentioned disputes." "She would," I said. They didn't push further. Instead, they asked reasonable questions about water runoff, about wildlife, about whether the lake ever flooded in spring. Real homeowner questions, not territorial ones. For the first time since I bought the property, I felt like I was talking to neighbors instead of adversaries. A month later, Elise surprised me. She knocked on my door holding a folder. "I hope this isn't weird," she said, "but we found something while renovating the garage." Inside the folder were old photos. Grainy, sun-faded pictures of the lake from decades earlier. No manicured lawns. No stone paths. Just rough grass, fishing lines, and a narrow dock barely wider than a canoe. "This was here before the subdivision," she said. "Before Karen." I nodded. "That tracks." "There's more," she said, flipping a photo over. On the back was a hand-drawn sketch. A crude boundary line, almost identical to the survey. "That's why we wanted to show you," she said. "The fence didn't change anything. It just put things back." That stayed with me. As winter deepened, the neighborhood adjusted. People stopped walking down paths that no longer existed. Kids learned new shortcuts. The lake became something you looked at, not something you wandered into. And surprisingly, no one complained. In early February, the county sent me a letter. Not a complaint. A notice. They were updating property records to reflect recent surveys in the area. Apparently, my situation had triggered a wider review. More than one homeowner would be receiving updated maps. 2 weeks later, I heard shouting down the road. Not Karen's voice, but close enough. Another neighbor, red-faced, arguing with a surveyor. Stakes in the ground. Lines being redrawn. It turned out Karen hadn't been the only one borrowing space. The fence had done something unexpected. It had reminded people that land isn't defined by habit. It's defined by records. Some folks adjusted quietly. Others didn't. But none of it was my problem. Spring came with thawed ground and new growth. Grass pushed up along the fence line, softening its edges. Birds nested on the posts. The lake returned to its deep, glassy blue. One afternoon, Mark waved me over. "We wanted to ask you something," he said. Elise stood beside him, hands in her pockets. "We were thinking of hosting a small neighborhood picnic. Nothing big, just people. And you're wondering if the lake is part of that," I said. They nodded, bracing themselves. "It can be," I said slowly, "under a couple of conditions." Their shoulders relaxed instantly. "First," I continued, "it stays supervised. Second, access is through the gate. Third, everyone understands it's a privilege, not a right." Mark grinned. "That sounds fair." The picnic happened in May. Blankets. Folding chairs. Kids skipping stones under watchful eyes. No one crossed the fence without asking. No one assumed anything. People treated the lake like something borrowed, not owned. And it was better that way. At one point, I noticed the fence had become invisible. Not physically, but socially. People stopped commenting on it. Stopped resenting it. It simply existed. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Elise sat beside me on the dock. "You know," she said, "when we first moved in, I thought the fence was harsh. And now?" I asked. "And now," she said, "I think it saved the neighborhood from a lot of future fights." I watched the water ripple under the fading light. Karen's house was lit again now, new owners, new routines, no memory of borrowed land or imaginary borders. Life moved on, as it always does. The fence hadn't been about punishment. It had been about clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the kindest thing you can give a place, even if it takes a little wood, a little paperwork, and one very loud meltdown to get there. By summer, the fence had stopped being a story. That, I realized, was its greatest success. It no longer sparked conversations or curious glances. No one pointed at it during walks or whispered about the lake situation. It stood quietly, doing the one thing it had always been meant to do: mark a boundary and hold it. I noticed the change one evening when a delivery driver pulled up, glanced at the fence, and didn't hesitate. He followed the posted signs, used the gate, and went about his business, without a single confused question. No assumptions. No entitlement. Just order. Mark and Elise settled into the neighborhood like they'd always belonged there. They waved. They asked before making changes. When Mark wanted to trim a tree near the boundary, he came over with a tape measure and a simple question. "Can you take a look with me?" We walked the line together, checked the survey pins, and agreed on a solution that worked for both of us. It was refreshing. One afternoon, Elise told me something I hadn't expected. "We ran into Karen at the grocery store," she said carefully. "Oh," I replied. "She didn't recognize us at first," Elise continued. "But when she did, she looked relieved. Like she was glad we weren't angry with her." I nodded slowly. People usually aren't angry about land. They're angry about losing control. That summer, the lake became what I'd hoped it would be from the start. Quiet mornings with mist rising off the surface. Evenings with crickets and the soft splash of fish. I built a small dock extension, fully permitted, modest, functional. Nothing flashy. Just enough to sit and let my feet dangle above the water. One evening, as I tightened the last bolt, an older neighbor named Thomas stopped by. "You know," he said, leaning on his cane, "this lake caused arguments long before Karen." I looked up. "Really?" "Oh yes," he chuckled. "People have been pretending it belonged to them since the 70s. You're just the first one who proved otherwise." That stuck with me. Boundaries don't create conflict, I realized. They reveal it. Late August brought a storm. Fast, loud, and violent enough to knock branches loose and send waves slapping hard against the shore. When it passed, I walked the fence line to check for damage. Everything held. Not one post had shifted. Not one panel had loosened. The gate latch clicked into place like it always had. On Karen's former side, I noticed something else. The new owners had planted hedges along their yard. Perfectly aligned with the fence, carefully measured, respectful. No creeping vines. No accidental extensions. They understood the lesson without having lived the drama. That fall, the county finalized its updated maps. New markers appeared along several properties, and while some neighbors grumbled, no one challenged it openly. The line had been drawn, literally and figuratively. On the one-year anniversary of buying the lake, I sat on the dock at sunset with a simple thought. I hadn't won anything. I had restored something. The lake wasn't a trophy. The fence wasn't revenge. They were corrections, quiet, firm, necessary. As the sun dipped below the trees, the water turned to glass, reflecting a world neatly divided, finally honest. And somewhere beyond the fence, life went on, respecting the line that held.